All right, today we're going to unpack a logistical puzzle that is, well, it's so complex that getting it right versus getting it wrong is literally a billion-euro question. And at the very heart of it all, the German railway system.
Now, this is way more than just getting one train from point A to point B. I want you to picture this: thousands of individual train cars. Each one starts in a different city, and each one needs to end up somewhere totally different. So how on earth do you orchestrate all that chaos without, grinding the entire country to a halt?
Well, there's an official name for this giant puzzle, and it's called wagon load traffic. And it's basically the art of taking all those single wagons, sorting them, grouping them into totally new trains, and then sending them on their way, all while keeping the whole network from collapsing. Okay, so to solve this massive puzzle, we first need to understand its key pieces. What are the fundamental building blocks that even make a system like this work in the first place? And probably the single most important piece of this whole thing is something called a formation yard. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a huge post office sorting center, but for trains. Wagons roll in, they get sorted by where they're going, and then they're put together into new trains that are all heading in the same general direction.
So when you use these yards as central hubs, what you're really doing is creating a classic hub and spoke network. And the whole point of that is, instead of having tons of half-empty trains just crisscrossing the country, you get fewer, much fuller, and way more efficient trains running just between these major hubs. But of course, all that efficiency, it comes at a price. And that brings us to the core economic problem here. See, these hubs are incredibly expensive to build and to operate. So deciding just how many of them you need creates this massive financial trade-off. So here's the central dilemma, right? On the one hand, if you build fewer hubs, you save a ton of money on infrastructure costs. But your trains have to travel longer, less direct routes. On the other hand, if you build more hubs, your transportation gets super streamlined, but now you're shelling out cash to operate all those extra facilities. It's a real catch-22.
And this is the billion-euro question that researchers from TU Dortmund University wanted to answer. It's not just how many hubs, it's also how big should they be, and where exactly do we put them? All to find that absolute perfect cost-saving sweet spot.
So how in the world do you even begin to tackle a problem this big? I mean, you can't just start building multi-million-euro yards all over the country just to see what works, right? No. Instead, you build a digital one first. What they did was create this incredibly sophisticated mathematical model. Think of it like a digital twin of the entire German railway network. And this let them do all sorts of things. They could build, tear down, and completely rearrange their virtual rail system over and over and over again, all to find the best possible design, without spending a single real-world euro.
And let me tell you, this model was seriously detailed. We're not just talking about placing dots on a map here. It had to figure out things like which locations should actually become hubs, what's their capacity, which smaller stations should feed into which hub, and even how many different types of trains are needed on every single route. It's a lot.
So once they had their digital railroad all built, it was time to put it to the test with some real-world data.
The thing is, the original model was just so complex. It was actually really difficult for computers to solve efficiently. So they also engineered a leaner, what they called a reduced version. They did this by cleverly finding and removing redundant mathematical rules. The whole idea was, hey, maybe a smarter, simpler model can find better answers and find them faster. And it worked. The result was a much leaner model. The number of variables, and you can think of those as all the possible choices the computer can make, like build a hub here or don't build one there, that number was cut by almost 20%.
But here's what's even more important. The number of constraints, that's the super complex web of rules that the model has to follow, that was slashed by over a quarter. So you think a leaner model with fewer rules would be a faster, better problem solver, right?
So they took both versions, the big original one and the new lean one, and basically pitted them against each other across a whole bunch of different test scenarios. And to keep things practical, they gave the computers a hard deadline. Find the absolute best answer you can in just 3 hours.
Okay, and this is where things get really, really interesting. Because after all that work to build a smarter, leaner model, the results were, well, they were not what anybody expected.
It turns out the smarter, reduced model wasn't always better. In fact, sometimes it was worse. Its performance was totally counterintuitive and, honestly, pretty inconsistent.
Just take a look at this. In scenarios that were simpler, say with only 2 types of trains, the big original model actually found the better solutions. But when the problem got more complex, with 3 train types, that's when the lean, reduced model came out on top. So it seems like what's smarter really depends on the specific question you're asking.
And this quote from the researchers themselves, Sender and Clausen, really sums up the whole challenge. They said, closing the gap and proving the optimality are highly time-consuming. Basically, even with these super powerful models, finding a truly perfect, 100% optimal solution it's incredibly hard and takes a ton of computing time. In a lot of their tests, they found a pretty good solution, say 95% perfect, really quickly. But that last 5%, getting from good enough to perfect, that took forever.
And this brings us to the real takeaway of the whole thing. The goal here isn't to find one single perfect magic bullet answer. It's about building better tools, powerful tools that let human experts test out their ideas, really understand the trade-offs, and ultimately make smarter, more informed decisions about this kind of critical infrastructure.
Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. If a digital railroad, something that's perfectly controlled, is this complex to get right, what does that say about the massive, messy, and totally unpredictable real-world systems we all rely on every single day? I mean, how do you plan for a future that you know is always going to be more complicated than your simulation?